Villa Windsor, for Route du Champ d'Entraînement, Paris, is a grand 14-room neoclassical villa tucked behind high walls on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne in Paris's 16th arrondissement. Built in 1928 to 1929 by architect Roger Bouvard for French politician Henri Lillaz, it was originally called Château Le Bois and features a limestone facade, tall columns and wrought-iron balconies. Henri Lillaz had taken a long lease from the city to build the new villa, promising to invest heavily in construction. The result was a lavish country-style house, richly furnished and decorated to match, intended for Lillaz's social entertaining. Over the decades, it remained city property, leased at nominal rates to successive tenants. Notably, General Charles de Gaulle and his family lived here from 1944 to 1946, when the villa served as a temporary presidential residence just after the liberation of Paris. De Gaulle's wife reportedly found the grand interior almost too opulent, especially knowing it had been used by Hermann Göring as Nazi headquarters during the occupation. By the late 1940s, the de Gaulles had moved to Bagatelle next door, leaving the property vacant for several years. After his abdication in December 1936, the former King Edward VIII, now the Duke of Windsor, and his American wife Wallis Simpson found themselves in a state of comfortable exile outside Britain. Bound by British convention not to reclaim the throne, they chose to live abroad. By the early 1950s, they were spending most of their time on the continent, including a rented Paris apartment, 24 Boulevard du Suchet, and a seaside villa on the Riviera. In 1952, however, the French government granted them a unique opportunity. The city of Paris leased Villa Windsor to the Windsors on a long-term, nominal rent. The villa had been vacant since de Gaulle left, and the city, eager to keep this famous couple in Paris, offered it to Edward and Wallis at a peppercorn rate, reportedly about $50 per year on a 50-year lease. The Duchess herself reportedly stumbled across the property in 1953, and negotiations were swiftly concluded. The Windsors' decision to accept this offer had several motivations. After the war, they had little prospect of returning to Britain. Winston Churchill and George VI were not enthusiastic about the Duke's presence. France, by contrast, welcomed them. Edward had served as governor of the Bahamas during the war, and Wallis had French sympathies. Becoming permanent residents of Paris was thus a logical choice. Queen Elizabeth II even later accepted Edward's request to allow Wallis to be buried beside him in Windsor after her death. Moreover, the Duke and Duchess had discovered nearby Le Moulin de la Tuilerie, a rural estate south of Versailles, for which British funds were provided in 1952 as compensation. But they also needed a city home, one with gardens and privacy, and 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement was ideal. In October 1952, the Windsors formally agreed to take the villa. The Paris City Council quickly enacted the lease. Per media reports, this deal was arranged at the suggestion of Paris's mayor, Jacques Chirac, who wanted to rehabilitate the then dilapidated villa. It was agreed that in exchange for the nominal lease, the Windsors, and later Al-Fayed, would restore the property. Within a few months, the Duchess engaged Maison Janssens' Stéphane Boudin to refurbish the interior to her exacting standards. Thus, in 1953, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor took up residence at the house, which they immediately redecorated under Boudin's direction. From then on, 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement became their principal Paris home, a privileged leasehold granted by the City of Paris and effectively reserved for this royal couple. In practical terms, living at Villa Windsor gave the Windsors exactly what Wallis wanted: proximity to Paris, society and culture, while retaining a private, almost palatial retreat. Unlike their smaller apartment on the Rue de la Faisanderie or at Cap d'Antibes, the Bois de Boulogne villa had the spacious gardens Edward desired and the city location Wallis craved. It was described as close as the Duchess could hope to having a palace of her own, echoing her statement that she wished to run my own house. In practice, 1953 marked the beginning of more than 3 decades in which the Duke and Duchess lived at Villa Windsor as gracious host and hostess in exile, paying no more than a token rent to the city of Paris. Once the Windsors settled in, Wallis Simpson set about giving the villa an interior befitting their royal status. She collaborated closely with Stéphane Boudin, head of Maison Janssen, the premier Paris decorating firm, to transform the newly leased home into a sumptuous palace of her own taste. The result was a blend of old-fashioned pomp and post-war posh, as one author put it, where Buckingham Palace met Versailles. Almost every room bore Boudin's signature, 18th-century panelling, often painted in pale blue, Wallis blue or soft yellow, gilded mouldings, and finely restored antique furnishings. The Duchess insisted on perfection, crystal and porcelain always polished to a shine, and Vogue photographer Horst P. Horst later remarked on how surpassingly clean and luminous the interiors were. According to contemporaneous accounts, the villa retained its basic 1929 layout, entrance hall, salons, library, dining rooms, etc., but received a complete cosmetic overhaul. The ground floor was primarily given over to public entertaining spaces. Guests entered through a tall, columned foyer that opened into a dramatic 2-story Italianate hall. This main hall was trimmed with marble-like trompe-l'oeil paint and hung with tapestries. It even featured a hand-painted ceiling that simulated a blue sky above. From the hall one accessed the villa's principal reception rooms. To one side was a formal drawing room, sitting room, in pale blue and gilt, panelled with 18th-century woodwork and furnished with French gilt chairs and sofas. In the photos from 1963, one sees an elegant arrangement, a restored Chippendale banqueting table facing French windows to the garden. Walls were hung with fine art and occasional trophies, and the Duchess's beloved pugs made themselves at home. Their likenesses appear in porcelain figurines and embroidered pillows throughout the public rooms. The library or study was another notable chamber. Dark-panelled and lined with books on military history and politics, it displayed the Windsors' personal portraits painted by British artists, Wallis by Gerald Brockhurst, Edward by Alfred Munnings. Leather furniture, wood floors and Persian rugs created a cosy, scholarly atmosphere. Adjacent to the library was a cerulean blue dining room painted in Wallis's favourite colour. It contained a large William and Mary-style dining table and Janssen's Louis XV-style chairs covered in white damask. Antique chinoiserie panels, originally from Chanteloup's chateau, covered the walls, and a Venetian Rococo console and gilded mirror provided further opulence. In total, the second main floor of the villa held roughly 7 major entertaining spaces, including the dining room, music room, 2 salons, a morning room and the large hall, as well as a small chapel that Wallis had installed along the main staircase, dedicated to St. George. Upstairs, the villa's private quarters were tucked into the 3rd floor, the attic level under the mansard roof, and the 2nd floor's rear wing. The Duke and Duchess had separate suites of bedrooms. Wallis's bedroom suite was famously decorated in Wallis blue, a turquoise shade she helped inspire in 1937 to match her eyes. One account notes contrasting red Persian rugs against blue walls, reflecting her bold taste. Edward's bedroom was similarly lavish but more masculine, with dark woods and leather. The servants' rooms occupied the topmost attic spaces. A marble staircase connected all floors, leading from the grand hall up to the Duke and Duchess's floors. In total, the villa contained about 14 rooms, counting reception rooms, bedrooms, and service rooms. Other details of the interior highlight the Windsors' style. Much antique furniture and art was either left from Lillaz's ownership or inherited from royal collections. For example, on display was the actual Chippendale desk at which Edward signed his abdication in 1936, later acquired by Al-Fayed. The walls and tables often held Oriental porcelain, empire clocks, tapestries from Haussmann's collection. each chosen by Wallis during the 1950s refurnishing. Outside, the villa's architecture continued the elegance: double-height Corinthian columns, French doors, and a balcony overlooking the gardens lent grandeur to the exterior. A wrought-iron gate, added later, provided privacy. As Fondation Mansart notes, the Windsors villa retained all of the architectural choices of the original 1929 design even after redecoration. In short, the interior of Villa Windsor during the Windsors' years was a seamless fusion of French classical taste and Anglo-American opulence, meticulously curated by the Duchess under the guidance of Maison Jansen's Stéphane Boudin. Wallis Simpson's day at Villa Windsor was a mixture of grand entertaining and private routine. She was known as an exacting hostess and keeper of order. Even small dinner parties at the villa ran like clockwork. It was said she and Edward would meet each evening at 7 p.m. sharp for cocktails in their salon. Afterwards, the hosts and a few guests would dine at elaborately set round tables, with music from the gallery and candlelit crystal and silver. Wallis habitually kept a grumble book in which she noted any lapses in service or decoration. Vogue photographer Horst later remarked on surpassingly clean rooms in the villa, testament to Wallis's insistence on perfection. Daytime hours were filled with refinements. According to contemporaries, Wallis enjoyed arranging flowers, reading in the libraries, and attending to her own wardrobe. She famously loved fashion and fine jewellery. She once admitted privately, "The possession of beautiful things is thrilling to me." Yet despite their sumptuous surroundings, the Windsors' social circle was constrained. British royalty largely spurned them, viewing Edward's abdication as a closing of the door. So much of Wallis's life at the villa was lived among a small circle of friends and local Parisian society. When Edward became ill with cancer in 1972, Wallis tended to him devotedly in the villa. The Duke died in his bedroom there in May 1972. Wallis then spent 14 more quiet years at Villa Windsor. Her own health declined. By the late 1970s, she was frail and, as her personal secretary later recalled, largely confined to bed by dementia. Reports from family friends noted that in the 1980s, the Duchess saw very few visitors and was cared for by a handful of long-time servants. In this period, the grand house grew solemn. One aide said the place felt like a mausoleum because both spouses had died there. Nevertheless, Wallis kept certain habits, like requesting afternoon tea and listening to music in her bedroom. She died at Villa Windsor in April 1986. For over 2 decades, the Windsors used Villa Windsor as a venue for legendary dinner parties. They hosted numerous celebrities, artists, and socialites. Opera singer Maria Callas, film stars Elizabeth Taylor, often accompanied by Richard Burton, stage legend Marlene Dietrich, and social queen Diana Mitford were among the frequent visitors. The couple also entertained titled guests and tycoons. Guests included Aga Khan III and his sons, media magnate Aristotle Onassis, photographer Cecil Beaton, and even on one occasion a young Mohamed Al-Fayed. In her memoirs, Wallis noted that invitations to Villa Windsor were carefully chosen. She preferred intimate dinners of about 8 to 16 persons at finely set tables. Beyond society parties, the villa played host to a few historically notable gatherings. In January 1972, Queen Elizabeth II, her husband Prince Philip, and son Charles paid a private visit to the Duke in his ailing condition. This was a rare reconciliation. The Queen spent 2 hours at the villa on May 30th, 1972, reportedly to say goodbye. Charles later recalled the meeting briefly in interviews decades later. Toward the end of the 20th century, after the Windsors were gone, Villa Windsor briefly became entwined with Princess Diana's story. On August 31st, 1997, Dodi Fayed brought Diana to the villa for a private meeting. They spent about half an hour inside while planning a future together. Tragically, that same night, both were killed in a car crash in Paris, just meters from Villa Windsor's entrance, They were allegedly en route to take up residence in the house. When Wallis Simpson died in April 1986, Villa Windsor reverted to the ownership of the city of Paris. Almost immediately, the city leased the property to Mohamed Al-Fayed, an Egyptian-British businessman, then owner of Harrods, for a long-term term. In exchange, he agreed to restore the villa at his own expense, reportedly investing tens of millions of francs. Al-Fayed also negotiated to acquire much of the Windsors' original furnishings. Wallis had willed all her jewellery and personal treasures to Paris's Pasteur Institute, and Al-Fayed paid the institute to purchase and hold on to these items. By July 1997, he announced plans to auction the villa's contents, 40,000 lots of furniture, clothing, photos and heirlooms, through Sotheby's. The sale was postponed by Dodi and Diana's deaths, but was rescheduled for February 1998. In that auction, the major items, including Edward's desk, Wallis's jewels, and many custom furnishings, fetched millions, with proceeds donated to Diana-related charities. Unofficial reports later said most lots were quietly bought back by or returned to the British royal family. During this transitional period, the empty villa stood closed to the public as its fate was decided. Over the next 3 decades, Al-Fayed transformed Villa Windsor. In the late 1980s and 1990s, he undertook a sweeping restoration. News reports estimate he spent on the order of 30 million francs, roughly $12 million, upgrading the house. He sought to preserve the 1950s Windsor atmosphere. Original pastel wall colours and gilt mouldings were refreshed, parquet floors polished to their former lustre, and much of the Duchess's chosen decor scheme was reinstated. Al-Fayed was honoured by the French government, made an officer of the Légion d'honneur in 1989 for saving the villa's heritage. He also collected and exhibited Windsor memorabilia on site. Dozens of furniture pieces, portraits, and personal items he had repurchased were placed on display in the first 2 floors, effectively turning part of the villa into a private Windsor museum. In publicity, Al-Fayed even renamed the property Villa Windsor, cementing its link to Edward and Wallis. He was famously possessive of the villa. As a guest recalled in 1986, Al-Fayed adored the fantasy of living among royalty at Windsor's old home. Over the years, he used the house for lavish family events, often accompanied by his son Dodi. Notably, in August 1997, Dodi brought Princess Diana to visit the villa. They left around sunset and planned to return later, making international headlines. The villa remained Al-Fayed's holiday residence until his death in 2023. Today, following his estate settlement, the villa's fate has passed to the city of Paris again, but its restored interiors largely reflect the Windsors' era, thanks to Al-Fayed's decades of caretaking. The city of Paris has entrusted Villa Windsor to the Fondation du Patrimoine, Mansart Foundation, with plans to open it as a public historic site. In 2021, Paris signed a 32-year lease with the Mansart Foundation, and in 2022, restoration work began. The foundation is cataloguing the estate's history and refurbishing every room to its original appearance, targeting an expected reopening for the 2024/2025 period. The budget is on the order of 8 to 9 million euros, financed by public and private sponsors. When completed, visitors will be able to tour the main living floors and see reassembled antiques, fashions, and decor from the Windsors' time. Some original pieces have already been reacquired or reproduced. As of 2025, Villa Windsor is being prepared to serve as a museum and cultural venue, once again revealing to the public the extraordinary stories of Edward VIII, Wallis Simpson, and the extraordinary life they led in this Parisian villa. Sources: contemporary accounts and archival research have been used throughout. Among the sources consulted are the mansion's own architectural record and newspaper features, specialised articles on the Windsor's Paris home, and historical references for post-1986 developments, as well as historical Paris guides. These provide the factual basis for the above narrative.